let's kick off with this. I think we've got about half an hour that we can chat, if that's all right for everyone. We just only have 2 microphones, and they're on cables, so we might get tangled, but that's all part of the fun. So that's quite all right. So I mean, first of all, my first question for the audience, everyone wants those toys now that we just saw, right? Everyone wants some of those things. Those are amazing. That's crazy stuff. And it's clear that we're kind of starting to use web technologies in new places, right? So we've had a lot of the day talking about using web technologies in browsers and where they can go, and conversation around that. But now we're starting to see web technologies move to other places. So I think maybe our first question will go to Matt. You mentioned the tool that you built was an Electron app, right? And it was starting to use web technologies elsewhere, not in browsers. Now, is that because it was the best thing to use? Because it's the tool that is at hand? What's the motivation?
So do you mean specifically Electron or just the web?
No, using web technologies and taking them out of the browser in people's hands and then using them for other things.
Yeah, so for a start, it was, I was trying to prototype in a few different languages, and I wasn't getting very far. And my next thing I tried was web audio, and I was able to get very far very quickly.
Yeah.
And I just never stopped. I'm still working on it. There's been ups and downs, like with anything.
So is this you scratching one itch, and then before you know it, you've built something out?
Yeah, I mean, what I have now is nothing like what I set out to build. I mean, it's what I always wanted to have, but I never expected to be able to get this far.
Yeah. And so do you think that this is the kind of tool that other people are going to adopt? What's the adoption you're seeing? Are you seeing other people use it?
Using my tool that I've made? I don't think anyone's using it seriously like I am, but there's a lot of people fiddling with it, yeah.
Cool. And so Ken, you were talking kind of the other way earlier on, right? You were talking about whether or not on the web we should start bringing other types of development forward. So rather than using something that was based on a document model once upon a time, starting to make apps there and bringing those into the web model. This almost feels like it was the opposite thing happening. So simple question: did it make you cross?
Did it make me cross? Oh no, I use web technology for all kinds of shit. I built a robot crossbow.
Sorry, I may have misheard that.
Yeah, a robot crossbow.
A robot. That's not terrifying at all.
So I used React Native for it. So
right.
I guess technically it was a native app, but I mean it was all JavaScript driven. So I'm all about taking web technology and doing crazy business with it.
Nice.
So that didn't make me cross at all. That's awesome.
Excellent. Okay, because it feels like we're starting to see web technologies being used all over the places, right? So we mentioned Electron, and we're seeing kind of, I don't know, Spotify, I've used, that's basically web technologies. Slack is web technology. So it's kind of starting to see that all over the place, right? So if that's happening, is it the case that browsers are going to start to embrace some of these APIs as well and start to embrace some of these capabilities? So should we expect everything eventually to be made with web technologies?
I would like it to.
Yeah.
I mean, I released an Electron app 3 weeks ago.
Nice.
I mean, 2 weeks ago. So I mean, I'm pretty all in on that. I think that it's mobile browsers specifically need to step up a little bit.
Yeah.
But I mean, generally on the desktop, you could do all kinds of things. And with web technologies themselves, just like JavaScript, there's not a lot of things you can't do.
Cool. Okay, excellent. And so you touched a little bit on, you mentioned progressive web apps, or what was the name you used?
Performant websites for Android.
Right, okay, which I know has got a few people twitching as they hear that. And certainly, we can think of those as being something that's prevalent on the Android platform, where Chrome can live. But Peter comes along and he's like, well, you know what? You can use some of these technologies, and of course, progressive web apps are a collection of technologies and an approach, right, rather than a product or a particular single thing. So now, Peter, with Samsung Internet, eventually we're starting to see that go elsewhere. Does that mean that we can really start using progressive web apps as a thing? And that's approach. There's a microphone over there as well, which might be closer to you. Or you can just double up.
Yeah. So with progressive web apps, we've been saying for a while that it's fine to start using it now. It was fine to start using it a while ago because it's technologies that you can use via progressive enhancement, and you don't necessarily need to worry about, obviously Safari is going to take a bit longer, although we had the great news a few weeks ago that they are starting to work on service worker support. So yeah, I think these are technologies we can start using now, and I do recognise that it's early days, Ken. It's early days, but I think the web has to evolve to get there. I think actually having some kind of revolution in browsers might be tricky. We have got a load of amazing web content out there, and one of the nice things actually about the way some things are evolving is that, like we saw with web VR and viewing websites in a virtual reality browser, making sure that we actually have a great way to view all of the content, even if it's had these things added within progressive enhancement as well. We can do that. In the web VR world, your legacy 2D content can just be a 2D window inside the 3D world around you. And I think we should try to keep doing that. So these are additional things you can add in, makes everything even better. And I think I'd like to think about progressive web apps. Sorry if I'm hogging this slightly. I do like to think about progressive web apps in two different ways. One is that they're a toolkit rather than a recipe. So there is quite a lot of, there is a bit of a backlash against it being seen as a marketing term, and what does it really mean for us developers? And that term is useful in some ways just because it helps to share it as a possible alternative to some of the things that you might use with native apps. But it's not necessarily so useful for us to think about as developers when we're thinking about, you can use service workers to get caching, get better performance without having to have a whole progressive web app necessarily. So you can use these things individually, but then the flip side of that is that you also get some added benefits if you do stick to the recipe. And if you use all of those aspects of the toolkit, then you can get better benefits as well, because some of those things are recognized by the browser, like with the ambient badging that I showed. So if it recognizes the browser that you're using service workers and web app manifest and it's HTTPS, and if you've got a right icon for your home screen, then you can get an extra little plus icon. And I think we're going to see more and more of those things. So yeah, it's early days, but I think this is the right technologies to bank on, and we'll see it evolving from there.
Yeah, and I think, so we kind of talk about progressive web apps sometimes about the features that they bring along, so the kind of capabilities and what have you. But kind of you kind of called out something in particular about the way things look and like the visual differences there, because I certainly have found that when I've been trying to push for building things off the web, one of the big points of friction as well, it just can't quite compete with some of the things we can do visually, in native applications, right? So, and I think people around this panel might have kind of differing, views of that and different experiences. But now we're starting to talk about trying to push augmented reality and virtual reality through the same framework and through the same tools. So, just as we're starting to close the gap, is it getting wider again? So, I mean, Jordan, what do you think about that now that we're trying to close the gap about how things look native versus in the web? Have we got an insurmountable challenge there?
I mean, if we're talking about like performance and certain features, the web I think will often be playing catch up. But it's just a different game the web is playing, I think. We have URLs in the web. We don't have app stores. We can run content everywhere. It just doesn't seem like a fair comparison, even though it is, maybe a couple of years ago, strange if you think about Bluetooth or VR on websites. It just doesn't seem like it doesn't seem like a good comparison. Like sometimes you should use a native app. Personally, I don't like that. But if it can benefit from being on the web, why not do it? It's just hard to compare, I think.
Right.
I always enjoy that perspective instead.
Yeah, I think it is really hard to compare, and when we're starting to try and figure out how to measure how things are performing and work on performance, then we kind of change the goalposts again, move the goalposts again. So Ben, I don't know how you kind of feel about that, about the fact that we're trying to understand how we optimize performance and measure performance and do all of those kind of things well, and then the UIs that we're expecting to drive and the kind of features we're expecting to drive are just getting further and further to app land, if you like. So how do we tackle that? How can we possibly compete?
Well, some of the stuff that I talked about today, I guess, was, about the premise of here's a bunch of resources, the browser downloads them in this particular way, and they're prioritized in this particular way. And here we are at a conference with, 350 attendees, and I don't really know how many people would know how the browser prioritized those resources, right? Like, we're all professional web developers, and for some reason, the very foundational aspect of us delivering content to a device, we don't know as a community. And there's something wrong there, right? Like, we don't understand the platform that we're building for entirely. And so I think with all of these new ways of having a UI, having devices and giving us feedback and all that sort of user experience stuff, I think maybe if you're a little bit hard on us as an industry, you'd say, well, we got to really get our shit together because we're not really doing good enough. We got a long way to go on the web, and these new AR and VR experiences, like Jordan said, we have no idea what we're doing, and we're just gonna keep throwing stuff at the wall and see what sticks. So I think performance-wise, we're really at the cusp of starting, like, using preload is the first time that we've been able to tell the browser what we want, what our intention is for something, and I don't know, it seems a little bit pathetic, really.
And since you're kind of sat right next to Sam with the microphone there, it feels like this is probably a good time to talk about Houdini a little bit as well. So yeah, we're trying to find new ways to tackle some of these challenges and try and find new ways that we can build codes that's expressive and kind of bring things to life. There was a question particularly about Houdini from Twitter. So Steve asked, how does Houdini affect performance in the browser? And since we're talking about performance, are there particular implications there? How does this work out?
Yeah, so the idea behind Houdini was specifically to take a lot of the effects that we want to drive app-like experiences and move them off of the main thread, move them off of the thing that blocks good performance for our users and make those effects performant. All the Houdini stuff runs in worklet threads, which are separate from the main thread, so that parallax effect that's so popular can run without preventing time to interaction or time to interactive from hitting, and can run without affecting first paint, and can run without blocking someone actually being able to tap on your stuff. So all of the Houdini stuff is designed really specifically to improve performance of the types of things we want on the web to make more app-like experiences.
Nice. And there was another question actually on Twitter. Is Houdini safe to use? And I know that you showed fairly emphatically whether it was ready to use or not. But when it is ready, is it kind of quote unquote safe to use, given that it introduces some other technologies into effectively layout?
Yeah, Houdini's safe. The way that the worklets work, and someone asked, I answered this on Twitter, and then I realized I crashed probably 50 worklets last night building that warning demo. If a worklet crashes, if it throws an error, I should say, it just stops and it gets spun down, but it doesn't block your main thread. It doesn't stop your JavaScript from executing. So if a worklet throws, then your website still works. You just lose whatever the effect that the worklet had. So yes, it is safe as long as you keep to the tenets of progressive enhancement and you understand that it's not kind of a catch-all. The worklets are meant to, like the layout worklet specifically, but all worklets are designs that if you run over paint budget for fast performance, they just will skip your frame for that worklet. So they're designed to be performant.
Cool. So this might be showing that I'm a bit of a fuddy-duddy when it comes to web development, or it might, I might have a slightly antiquated view, but I remember in the good old days, where we used to have this separation of concerns, right? Where we had content in the HTML, and then we had layout and design in CSS, and then we added behavior in JavaScript. It feels like I'm setting myself up for a fall whenever I talk about that now. I kind of feel like people are moving on and we're past that. Is that the case? I mean, were we doing that wrong? Have we moved past this kind of separation of concerns now? Because it feels like JavaScript and CSS and content style and behavior all seem to kind of get organized in together now. So have we moved past that? So, Sam, I'll stay with you for the moment. Everyone wants nothing to do with this.
So I'll pass this to Ben in a second, and I think every single person on this stage will have a different opinion on that.
Great.
My opinion is I'm mostly with you, but I understand the benefits of other ways of working, and we're working through it. I don't think we're quite at the point yet where separation of concerns is something we can throw away, but I think that a lot of the upcoming specs that are being produced will help us move forward a little bit, like the web component specs, and some of the Houdini specs will kind of help us do the things that we want to do with the frameworks like React and Vue in a way that doesn't mean that we're sending a megabyte of JavaScript down the wire.
Cool. Any more on that, Ben?
I got something for you. So firstly, you used the word fuddy-duddy. That was excellent.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed that. So the other thing that you said was separation of concerns. Now, I'd put it to you that back in the good old days, I don't know exactly when you're describing, but back in the good old days of when you had a jQuery file that did everything and it targeted some elements somewhere in the site and that there was some CSS in another file somewhere else completely, how was that a separation of concerns? It wasn't. That's the answer. So if you forget the fact that you've got a boundary of a different language from another language and start to look at what you're building as a product and trying to have a product that works, as a component or, in terms of componentry, then you're actually bringing those concerns, you're putting them in a bucket and they're together and they're still separated because they're still different components. So I just think that was fake news.
Well, I'll get right back into my box. I mean, I certainly think, you've invoked kind of the exact phrase that comes to mind for me, and that's components, right? So yeah, it feels like for making things modular and making things through a componentized model, this definitely feels like a logical way to organize things. But I don't know. It's taking me a while to catch up.
But that's the same as like AR and VR, right? It's a bit weird and we don't really know where it's going, but we just have to keep, it's not going to be put into production for a while until somebody vets it to the point where they're like, okay, I think we can deploy this and I think it'll work. And if it explodes, it'll be okay still. We need to keep doing those things.
Yeah, fair enough. And so, we're kind of touched on like organization of code and kind of the organization of the different aspects of code. Ava, maybe I can turn to you a little bit about the way that some of these developments are impacting the way that you might have organized, like CSS in particular, because I feel like it's a real art form, not just writing good CSS, but writing it in a way that the person who sits down in the chair next to you in a week from now can pick it up and continue. So given the way that things are changing, do you think that we've got to revisit the way that we organize our code in that way? Or do you think the practices are already there and we just need to do a better job of it?
I think that it has evolved a lot, and suddenly we have so many things that we didn't need before that we definitely need to take a look again at how we are organizing everything, how we are naming stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to look into systems such as VMM, which is really a good system, and it has provided for many years, the organization way. So we just need to keep on organizing and be careful because there is really a lot of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just hunting for a question that I saw earlier on Twitter. I think just seeing the approaches that you were describing, and then some of the things that Sam was looking at, and how quickly things like this move on. It's really hard to know which approach and which thing to bet on and to work on. So I think that spans more obviously than just CSS and more than just web development. But it feels like that's a challenge that all web developers have had to face. So I'd be kind of interested to hear how people select the right technologies and approaches. Maybe Ava, we could start with you since you're on the microphone.
I think we need to begin with experimenting stuff, everything that doesn't work in every browser. We need to grab a weekend project we have and we and try everything in there. and once we feel safe with it, that we can use it, and it works everywhere, then we can finally be safe to take it into production and into clients' websites.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Any other thoughts on how we choose the right technologies to bet on for anyone on the panel?
Just at least make sure that it works for everybody is a nice one. I mean, in terms of like just general accessibility, it's really easy to forget that you're building stuff for other people rather than making your life fun. So I just say that.
Anyone else? Because there's something that strikes me there, and that's the yeah, I couldn't possibly disagree with that. But just make sure it works for everyone seems that's a big goal, right? I mean, it's depending on the kind of thing that we're making, that can be pretty tough. But I definitely think it's the right thing to value. But there's also lots of tools that we use that the end user doesn't see, right? The approach that we use that might manifest in the same end product. And trying to find the right tool there to use, I think, can be quite challenging. I always bet on the wrong thing. I've still, Betamax video. That reference is way too old for this room. So I'm sorry about that. So I mean, like Ruth, for instance. I mean, you're always experimenting with like new APIs. I mentioned that you do crazy stuff with the web API, the audio API. We saw a lot of that. In the context of where you work, maybe the goalposts are a little bit different, right? Because you're building things that are really experimental. I mean, does that influence the way that you choose technologies quite differently?
Yeah, 100%. Like the stuff I build is not production stuff. It is crazy demos to try out this technology, to see what works, see what doesn't work, feed that back into the community, teach the community, open people's eyes. I mean, it came from back in the day when we were looking at Firefox OS, which is where progressive web apps came from as far as I'm concerned. So the idea that we're getting this new functionality is exciting. Yeah. And we don't need to keep all that new functionality, and we might be unsure of how some of that is going to work with things like VR and AR and some of the comments that have been made already, which is absolutely fine. But until we experiment, we're not going to know. I'm 100% for accessibility. When I make a website, I'm not going to chuck in something that's not, I'm not going to make it inaccessible for somebody. But that's a different kettle of fish. Something for production is not what you saw today. It's not my own piece of software for me to be experimenting with and challenging myself with, and being able to play with some of this new stuff that we might not be able to play on client projects with as well. Yeah. And it always comes back to this when we have questions like this, is every single project is different. And I think you already said it. You're not, although I have stuff I build for myself, you're not building for yourself, you're building for somebody else. You are not your user. That's the thing to bear in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm just kind of keeping one eye on Twitter. So thank you for people who are submitting questions on Twitter. So there was one just kind of flipping back to Houdini for a second, but it kind of is a fairly regular kind of consideration. Just wondering about how debugging works on Houdini and kind of Houdini threads. So are debugging tools coming? Is it just we'll get there one day?
So I don't know if code breakpoints work in worklets. I honestly haven't tried, but console log works, and we can debug everything with console log.
Did I hear there was applause for console log? Yeah. Wow. Wow. Okay. Well, if you're enjoying debugging with console log, you'll like debugging with alerts going to blow your mind. That's the future. Okay, that makes sense. And there was another question as well. So I'm bouncing around, so forgive me. But a question about Samsung Internet. So Peter, for you. So just wondering, you mentioned that this is going to be able to be installed and go elsewhere, not just on Samsung devices, but Samsung make all kinds of devices, so is it going to reach things like TVs? Might we one day see a TV with a good browser in it that we can do things with?
So at the moment, the browser that you get on the TVs is a little bit different. It's Tizen-based. And there aren't any immediate plans that I know of to replace those with something more akin to the version that's running on mobile. But if there is news about that, then it will be exciting to share that later. But it is a good point, though, and that mix of devices is something that we're interested in and want to do more around. So it is possible to stream content, I believe, from your browser to Samsung smart TVs. So that's another example of the kind of integrations that you can do if Samsung has the hardware and the software. So yeah, there are some integrations there with the TV, but it's a different kind of browser at the moment.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. I'll probably just a couple more questions. First one, this is from Kenneth Oakenberg. This is directed at you, Ken. Ken, why do you hate the DOM?
I just have hit the limits on it a couple different times. And it's not actually the DOM that's slow, it's the operations on the DOM that's slow. And it seems like the sort of thing that should have been fixed a while ago. And it's kind of like a minor hurdle to having it be like a full power platform. Because that's where like a lot of this, like, it just should be simpler. You know, you shouldn't have to be like a senior engineer at Google to make a performant website. It should be performant out of the box. And you should be screwing performance up, not achieving performance.
Right.
You know?
But it kind of feels like we were in that position for a while, right?
Well,
where we were screwing it up.
We are screwing performance up, right? Because it is performant by default for documents.
Right.
Because it's a document rendering engine. But we're not building documents. We're building interactive applications that are inspired by and look like they belong on a phone as a mobile app. Which is why we're kind of hitting the edges of what's possible right now. So I don't hate any technology. You know, I don't have personal feelings any which way about
right.
Some kind of technology. But you know, at the same time, it is frustrating that you know you do have like pretty amazing things on the web right now. Like you know, we're sitting here playing musical instruments on the web, right? And you know, I personally have made music libraries. I just, you know, I see a lot of things that are there, and then like, when did actual rendering take a backseat priority-wise? You know, that should be like job number one, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. So there was one. So I'm going to keep on saying just a couple more questions until they kick us out. But so there's an interesting one that I've lost. Oh yeah. So Thomas on Twitter earlier asked, do you think it should be illegal for an online newspaper to take 5 minutes, and I take it that might be hyperbole, but to take 5 minutes to load over a 2G or 3G connection? Should we be starting to penalize, other than just like users leaving, but should we be starting to penalize publishers for doing a bad job of getting content to people? Anyone got any thoughts on that? Again, everyone takes a step back.
I've got a mic, so I'll just chip in with a brief point, I suppose. I mean, it's an interesting point because we do have laws around accessibility, right? And then if someone actually can't access your site because it's just so slow, then that's inaccessible. And so I think in certain cases that might be fair, especially with government sites that have to be available for everyone. For publishers, I guess that's a bit of a step on from there, and I'm not sure I want to comment on that, but yeah.
Cool. Any other opinions on that?
Yeah, I also have a microphone, so. Yeah, if you're a newspaper, right, which, you know, generally means, I mean, you know, not like Times visualizations or anything, but, you know, generally speaking, you're a purveyor of static content, and your site takes 5 seconds to load, you're penalizing yourself.
Sure.
As a company and a site and a brand, because somebody's going to go to something quicker, and that's why we have an AMP carousel.
Okay, fair enough. So it's happening already.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, great. So I've got one last question, and so I mean, we've seen all kinds of kind of interesting new things today. So a lot of things that have been new to me. It's clear that front-end development and just web development in general is different now, right? It's not the same beast that it was 10 years ago, 5-10 years ago. And I think the on-ramp is quite different as well, right? So, you know, back in the good old day, when I was a fuddy-duddy, that's just for you, Ben, I remember opening Emacs, typing in a text file, saving it, and then loading it in a browser, and then like the instant gratification, that's what got me hooked. And the tools are different, the approach is different, the expectation is different. Is this now just a completely different prospect for people getting started? Where do you tell people to start now when someone says, I want to try my hand at web development? Who knows, where do you start? Ruth, do you want to pick that up first?
The only reason I'm going to answer this is I actually teach development.
Well,
I teach HTML and CSS on a course, and I teach the basics because I don't really know where else to start. I'm in the same boat as you.
What are the basics
teach?
now?
What are the important stuff? Basic HTML and CSS. I do a little sprinkling of Sass on the top. I teach them where to go to learn more, and I think that's the key. Is you still need that fundamentals. You need those basics. They're never going to go away. The web is still built on those technologies. And sure, it's a whole different kettle of fish, and it's pretty massive. And we're just going to get more specialized. Like, we've already seen that happen, right? We were web developers, then we were front-end and back-end developers. There's just going to be more progression over that. But you're still going to need those backbones, and having that knowledge is always going to be useful. And I just think you need to teach people how to learn as well. If anybody comes to you and says, how do I build a website, Phil? You can be like, well, you can use these technologies, and here's how you can build upon that knowledge. I think that's the only way. I think
that's probably the unless there's anyone else who wants to chip in. Anyone else? Ken?
Yeah, I'll hop in there. And I'll hop in there and call shenanigans.
Shenanigans?
Shenanigans.
Oh, it's been called.
That's right. Because, nothing is preventing anybody from getting started with fundamentals, like you said, which is where I think people should start with fundamentals. But if I were to start now, as opposed to when I did start, there has never been a time when you've had a more documented web with more tutorials. When I started, there wasn't even dev tools. The amount of tooling and things to catch you, right? I used to have websites go down in prod because of commas in lists. The amount of accoutrements that you have to save you time is greater than ever before. So, while it may seem overwhelming initially, it's you have people who start and they're like, yeah, I want to just write dank ass React apps day one, and you're like, whoa, chief, open up code sandbox or something and mess around a little first.
Can I ask, did you just use the expression dank ass?
Yeah.
Okay.
You guys don't say dank here?
I'm just making a notes of my my new vocabulary. Okay, I think that's the perfect note to end it on. When we talk about the resources that are there that are inspiring people, and the fact that there are events like this where people can learn just the first step and get inspired enough to want to go and learn themselves. I think that's a pretty good message to leave on. So bang on time. Thanks everyone on the panel. Can I just have another round of applause for everyone on the panel? All right.